In November of 1994, the early volleys of the 32-bit war had been fired. Sega had launched its Saturn in Japan with Virtua Fighter to immediate and unprecedented success for the company. Sega was also a force in the still booming arcade industry there, and they couldn't have had a better launch title to capture the interest of eager gamers looking to jump into 3D polygon gaming at home. It didn't take long at all for Sony to answer Sega's initial success by putting the spotlight on Battle Arena Toshinden, a 3D fighter with textured map polygons and a pile of fancy effects like transparencies and light sourcing. When gaming magazines in the West picked up the Japanese news about the two releases, they focused heavily on the Virtua Fighter versus Toshinden angle. For months they wrote countless articles about how much better Toshinden was graphically, paying little to no mind its rather shallow and simple gameplay. The draw to Toshinden had been almost entirely its visuals, and looking back on how quickly the series was replaced with other games on the same system, it was pretty clear it had little to no staying power beyond that. None of that mattered in the least, however, and Sega took a black eye in the US and Europe based on these early impressions. When the PlayStation launched in the United States in September, the gaming media doubled down once again, bestowing heaps of praise on Toshinden as the Saturn once again took flack for its lack of a game with similar visual prowess. Sony would declare Toshinden as a Virtua Fighter killer and proof positive that their PlayStation was clearly the superior option. But Toshinden was not a Sony product, and later that year a port by Nextech would find its way to the Saturn. Sega was hopeful that it would help boost the image of the Saturn, not just in games available, but also that their machine was fully capable of doing anything that was on Sony's PlayStation. In this episode, we'll take a look at the version that showed up on the Saturn, and see if it lived up to the hype created by their rival. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Battle Arena Toshinden Remix. First released in Japan under the name Toshinden S in November of 1995, this port was handled by Nextech, Takara, and Sega, with Sega publishing the US and European versions the following March under Battle Arena Toshinden Remix. With this coming out nearly a year after the PlayStation release, it was given additional modes and content to set it apart. It got an original intro, a brand new story mode, as well as an additional character. The gameplay itself was pretty much identical to the PlayStation version from there. You have a choice of 8 characters to choose from, a strange mix of fighters ranging from a dominatrix detective to your typical Ryu and Ken knockoffs. Basic movement includes the ability to dash forward and retreat quickly by tapping the appropriate direction twice, as well as a roll that allows you to avoid incoming attacks both toward and away from the screen. The combat is weapons-based, so each of these guys and gals has the usual assortment of whips, swords, clubs, and a few other strange contraptions to keep things interesting. Standard attacks consist of 4 main buttons. You have a weak and strong weapon attack, as well as a weak and strong kick. The majority of the special moves are based on your Street Fighter motions of quarter and half circle rotations from there, as well as a more complicated super move that usually requires you to go full circle motions or more. The structure of the matches are the best 2 of 3, and there is of course an end boss to contend with, and even a secret end boss should you reach the end without using continues. The Saturn exclusive boss is mixed in there as well. Endings are dependent upon who you fight at the end and which mode you are playing, so you have a number of endings to see if you are so inclined.
Round 1, fight!
The graphics of Toshinden use textured mapped polygons for the fighters against 2D backgrounds. You really can't go any further in this area without mentioning the PlayStation original. This was a visual downgrade in every area. The fighters are made of less polygons, resulting in a blockier look for each of them. The textures are worse as well, and clearly more pixelated. Those 2D backgrounds on the Saturn were actually in 3D on the PlayStation. They were never super detailed or complicated, but the move to 2D has robbed them of the little appeal that they had in the first place. Most of the beautiful transparencies of the PlayStation version are also gone. now replaced with the dreaded mesh effect we see all too often in these kinds of ports. As much as I hate to say it, virtually all of the original visual appeal of this game was utterly lost in this one. So what's that leave us with? Is any of it worth talking about? Well, it runs well enough most of the time, and some of the VDP2 background effects look nice. But outside of that, this was yet another stain on the Saturn's reputation at the time. Not only did it get Toshinden late, but it got a worse looking version on top of it. Every damn publication at the time made sure to mention this as well. Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, and loads of others just hammered it for being inferior. If Sega thought getting this one on the Saturn would score them some of that PlayStation popularity, boy were they wrong.
Bout 1, fight!
This is the part where I tell you that because Toshinden has a CD soundtrack that it's just as good on both versions. One of the few standouts of Toshinden was its music, and the extra track for the secret boss is really excellent. It's one of the few areas I'd say it was just as good as Virtua Fighter, and that's saying something because I really enjoyed that game's music. Let's listen to a couple of examples for you to enjoy.
Hey! Show them! Yeah! Oh, deadly! Hey! Look to them! Yeah! Look to them! Look to them! Look to them! Look to them! Cannon flash!
To be completely honest, Toshinden on the Saturn never stood a chance. It hit Japan first in November of 1995, right before the massive hit Virtua Fighter 2 landed. That meant in Japan, where the Saturn was most popular, nobody cared. Virtua Fighter 2 would go on to be the platform's best-selling game, while Toshinden was utterly lost in its wake. When it came to the US, every gamer mag had eviscerated it, and worse, Tekken had completely outclassed it among the PlayStation fans that originally loved it. So again, nobody cared. To pile on, both Tekken 2 and Soul Blade were out in the arcade with promised home ports in the pipeline. Toshinden had been a hit based almost entirely on its visuals and flashy presentation, but once deeper and more technical fighters arrived, it was pushed quickly to the side and never recovered the same level of interest. Its bad fortune didn't end there either. The epic 2D fighters had started arriving on the Saturn by this point as well, and since the Saturn actually did those well, even they outshined it. To paint a clearer picture on how timing and quality of this game was affected, Toshinden sold almost 700,000 copies in Japan on the PlayStation, while the Saturn version couldn't even break 100,000, despite being the #1 system there at the time. The US version sold so poorly, no official numbers were ever released by Sega. The sad reality is that there was simply no way this was going to help the Saturn. It was too close to Virtua Fighter 2, which absolutely destroyed it visually. So even if it had been a faithful port, Sega's own work would put it to shame. But it wasn't a faithful port, so now it had a rather pathetic fate of coming out much later and still looking worse than the PlayStation version, which itself had been passed by better games. The main addition to it had also been the story mode, but this mode bogs down the rhythm of the fighting. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good cutscene explaining things at the beginning, and maybe a good closing at the end, but having to sit through additional loading screens just to hear some voice-acted story scenes in between every single fight is something you really don't want to do. That pretty much leaves you with a worse looking and sounding game that has extra features that many won't appreciate. So again, poor Toshinden never stood any kind of chance on Sega's beleaguered platform.
Bout 1, fight!
Aurora Revolution! Rattlesnake! Thunder
After all of that, you would think I wouldn't recommend it to any of you. Actually, quite the opposite. I encourage you to pick this one up. While the gameplay is nothing special and certainly doesn't stand up to the better games at the time, it's easy to play and it's cheap. For what it is, you certainly can add much worse games to your Saturn library. Of course, the story of Toshinden on the Saturn is that you can also add much better games to your library instead. It never lived up to the source material, Sega's own line of fighters looked and played better, and perhaps most defining of all its failures, it got a halfway decent sequel that hardly anybody knows about, which for those of you interested, happens to be really cheap as well. The Saturn library is loaded with these stories of games that didn't quite live up to how the developers and publishers had hoped. Some of them failed because of timing, some of them because the Saturn hardware was just too much to handle, and some because the Saturn market was just too fragmented to support it. Often what was popular in Japan wasn't popular in the US and vice versa. I think Toshinden should be a cautionary tale for hardware manufacturers that exist even today. You rely too heavily on third-party titles, and you build a shaky foundation that may topple should your audience not embrace it. Sega needed to be laser focused on its own IPs, not publishing lesser ports of games that had made its competitors shine. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.